All right, in this video, we are going to talk about section 2.4, and that is about distribution shapes. Okay, so the distribution of a data set is a table, graph, or formula that provides the values of the observations and how often they occur. Okay, so you could have a frequency distribution, right, or relative frequency distribution, kind of like a table. You could have a graph. So here we have kind of two graphs, one put over the top of each other. So here you can see we have a histogram, right? And this is a relative frequency histogram, the green bars. And then there is this black curve that's put over the top of it. That's what's called a density curve, okay, for this distribution. So that's something we'll talk about in the future. All right, so the distribution might be a graph like that, and we're going to talk a lot about these graphs. All right, and so one of the things that we want to talk about is the shape of distributions. So it's important, an important characteristic of quantitative data set, and there are three important aspects: modality, symmetry, and skewness. Okay, so the first one, modality, is basically just about the peaks of the distribution. So here we're looking at these density curves. We can see it basically has one peak, okay, right here. So this one is called unimodal. This one has two peaks, right? So it's called bimodal. All right, and this one is multimodal. It has three or more peaks. Okay, so I was looking at some of the data on the coronavirus, and the graph I was looking at was bimodal. It had two peaks like that. So let's hope that that's the only peaks that we see. Right, it keeps going back down, but there was a little peak in May, and then sort of a big peak in June and July. So let's hope it's not multimodal. Okay, so that's modality. The next thing up is symmetry. All right, so symmetry, a distribution is symmetric if it can be divided into two pieces that are mirror images of one another. It's called symmetric, right? So for the first one here, let's see. Let me get it to where I can draw on this. And again, we're looking at these density curves here. So on this first one, this bell-shaped distribution, right? If we cut right here, exactly in the middle, then you can see that it looks exactly the same on this side as it does on this side, right? If we printed this off and I drew the line a little bit more carefully, but if I folded it along this line, we would see that this curve, part of the curve over here, would line up exactly with this part of the curve right here. So this bell-shaped curve is symmetric. This is a very important one that we'll talk a lot about later. So here's a distribution shape. It kind of looks like this, and we can see this one's symmetric because if we chopped it right here and then or printed this out on a piece of paper and then folded it right here at this line, we would see that this curve would, part of the curve would line up exactly with this part of the curve when we folded the paper. And this one is called the uniform distribution. If we cut it right in the middle, right, we can see that it looks exactly the same over here as it does over here. Again, if we printed this out and then folded along this line, every point on this blue curve would line up with exactly one point over here on this side, and vice versa. So all of these distributions are symmetric. A unimodal distribution that is not symmetric is called either right skewed or left skewed. So unimodal, it has to have one peak, right? So it's either going to be called right skewed if it has a really long right tail. So you can see this is not symmetric at all. There's no way, right? Because this tail, right, extends really far to the right. So the direction, right or left, is where the long tail is. Okay. So in this case, the long tail is over on the right. So this one is called a right skewed distribution. And this one is called a left skewed distribution because its tail has a really long tail, right, that extends really far over here to the left. Okay. All right. Another thing that we need to talk about is population data versus sample data. So population data are the values of a variable for the entire population, right? Remember we said you have some study that you're conducting, say maybe looking at the heights of everybody in the entire United States, right? So the population would be the entire population of the United States, right? And then if you take a sample, right, that is a smaller part of the population, right? And so that would be called sample data. Population data is also called census data. And remember, a census is where you go take data from every individual in your population. Okay. So population versus sample. So a population is going to have a distribution, right? And that's either called the population distribution or a distribution of the variable, right? And so the population distribution, there's only one of those. That is all possible data from every individual in your population. So if you could collect all of that and you would draw it out or organize it and make a histogram, there's only going to be one of those distributions. On the other hand, right, with sample data, right, there are lots and lots of different samples that can be taken from a population, right? There's millions and millions of people in, say, like your population, and you're taking a sample of 10 people randomly, right? Well, there's lots and lots of ways that you can choose 10 different people from a big population. So that means there are lots of different samples, and so the sample distribution is going to vary from sample to sample. So in the next thing, I have a picture. So that kind of illustrates this concept. So over here, I have a population distribution. That is all of the data from the entire population that I'm considering. And I graph it out. I make a histogram, right, like we talked about in the previous section. And that's the population distribution, and that's it. All right, and so here I take a sample. It doesn't tell me the size of the sample that I take, but there's lots of different samples, probably way more, right? That's indicated in this. We have just 6 here, but there's probably a whole bunch of those, many different ways that you could take samples, right? And for each way that you could take a sample, it's going to have its own distribution, right? You could take the sample data and make a histogram for it, right? And each one is going to be slightly different because it depends, right? The sample depends on who gets picked to be in the sample, right? And so it's going to vary. So there's lots of these sample distributions, but only one population distribution. All right, and normally we don't, when we're conducting, statistical studies, we don't know the population distribution, right? If we did, then we could just look at that data and, try to figure out if, what we're trying to accomplish. But in practice, you don't know that. It's usually too difficult to get all of that. So what we do in statistics, especially, right, inferential statistics, is take a simple random sample and use that to approximate the population distribution. All right, and the larger the size, and this is key that we'll see later on, the larger the sample size, the better the approximation tends to be. Okay, so you get better results by taking a larger sample, right? But the trade-off is that's going to be more work and time and money to take a larger sample. Okay, so there's kind of a trade-off there. And so one of the things that we'll do is, look at, what size our sample needs to be in order to get the kind of results that we want later on. Okay. All right. So that's it for this section, and in this section there's just some problems about looking at distributions either through density curve or with a histogram and classifying it as unimodal, bimodal, multimodal, or symmetric, left skewed, right skewed. Okay. All right. That is it for this section.